It was one of those days when everything seemed to crumble at once. The sun was shining outside, but inside me, a storm was raging. My name is Jill, and I used to believe I had everything under control, until life knocked me down harder than I ever imagined. It wasn't one thing that broke me, it was a series of small disasters, each piling on top of the other, until I felt buried. I had always been someone who tried to stay positive, who looked for the daily blessings even when life wasn't perfect. But now, all that felt far away, like a memory of a time I could no longer touch. I lost my job first. It wasn't just the loss of income that hit me hard, but the loss of purpose. I had always been proud of my work, feeling like I was contributing something meaningful to the world. But suddenly, I was just another unemployed woman in a crowded city, lost in a sea of people who seemed to have their lives together. I spent weeks applying for jobs, facing rejection after rejection, and with every email that came back with the words, "Thank you for applying," but my hope chipped away a little more. I started to feel like a failure, and worse, like maybe God had abandoned me. Then, my mother got sick. It felt like the universe was testing how much I could take. I would sit with her for hours in the hospital, watching her body weaken, and feeling completely helpless. She had always been the strong one in our family, the one who encouraged me to stay close to God, to keep my faith strong, no matter what. But now, I couldn't help but question everything. If God was so good, why was He letting this happen? Why was He letting her suffer, letting me suffer? The walls I had built around my heart started to crumble, and I found myself slipping further into despair. I stopped going to church. I couldn't bear to sit there, listening to sermons about gratitude and spiritual growth, while my life was falling apart. Every day felt like a battle just to get out of bed, to keep breathing, to keep moving forward. I didn't want to pray anymore, because it felt like my prayers were bouncing off the ceiling, unheard and unanswered. The peace I once found in prayer, the serenity I had in moments of quiet reflection, was gone. I felt completely alone. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights filled with anxiety and fear, I found myself sitting on the floor of my living room, staring at the empty space in front of me. The silence was deafening, and all I could think about was how I had failed in my career, failed my mother, and failed to keep my relationship with God intact. In that moment, I was overwhelmed with a wave of sorrow so intense that I didn't know if I could survive it. I started to cry, not just tears, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. It was the first time in a long time that I allowed myself to truly feel the weight of my pain. That was when something shifted. It wasn't a loud voice or a grand miracle, but a quiet realization, a whisper in my heart. You are not alone. It wasn't me talking, at least not consciously. But those words, simple and soft, stopped me in my tracks. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope, even just a little bit. Maybe I hadn't been abandoned. Maybe God was still there, waiting for me to open my heart again. The days that followed that small whisper were no easier. In fact, they grew darker. The problems in my life didn't suddenly vanish, and the weight on my chest didn't lift. My mother's condition worsened. The doctors started using words like incurable and palliative care. It felt like every breath I took was a fight, like the very air around me was thick with despair. Every time I visited her, I could see the life draining from her eyes. She tried to smile, to stay strong for me, but I knew the truth. I could see it in the way her hand trembled when she held mine, the way her voice faltered when she spoke about the future. I was furious with God. That small whisper I had heard, that tiny glimmer of hope, started to feel like a cruel joke. What was the point of hope if nothing was going to change? What kind of divine guidance leaves you in the dark, groping for answers that never come. I felt betrayed, not just by life, but by faith itself. And yet, deep down, in the quiet moments when I was alone, I still longed for something more, something to break through the unbearable anguish that had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. One evening, after another grueling day at the hospital, I sat in my car outside the building. The rain was coming down in sheets, hitting the windshield so hard I could barely see through it. I didn't want to go home. I didn't want to face the emptiness of my apartment, where the silence only reminded me of how disconnected I had become from everything that used to give me joy. I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, my knuckles white from gripping it too tightly, trying to hold myself together. Tears filled my eyes, blurring my vision. It felt like I was on the edge of something terrifying and unknown. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the seat next to me. It was a text from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The message was simple: thinking of you. Let me know if you need anything. I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. How could she know? How could anyone know what I was going through when I hadn't told a soul? I hadn't posted about my struggles online or reached out for help. I had isolated myself completely, drowning in my own sorrow. And yet, there she was, reaching out at the exact moment I felt like I couldn't take any more. I didn't respond to the message right away. Instead, I let it sit there, a small reminder that maybe, just maybe, someone, somewhere, cared about me. But the darkness was still there, gnawing at me, pulling me deeper into its grip. I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many people reached out, no matter how many positive affirmations I tried to repeat to myself, nothing would ever get better. I would always be stuck in this cycle of loss, disappointment, and fear. Days turned into weeks, and my life became a blur of hospital visits, sleepless nights, and overwhelming sadness. I had stopped going to the grocery store, stopped doing the little things that used to bring me joy, like cooking or listening to music. Everything felt like too much effort, like there was no point in trying anymore. My mother's condition continued to deteriorate, and with it, my sense of purpose. The faith that had once been my anchor had become a distant memory, something that belonged to another version of me, one I wasn't sure I'd ever see again. Then, one night, I reached a breaking point. I was sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at the floor, the weight of everything crushing me from all sides. My mother's frail face flashed in my mind, followed by the empty echo of my life without her. It was too much. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls down around me, to escape this endless suffering. But instead, I just sat there, frozen, unable to move. I didn't know it then, but that was the night something deep inside me shifted. It was the night I hit rock bottom. And sometimes, when you hit rock bottom, the only place left to go is up. The morning after that dark night, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned from the tears I had cried, and my body felt heavy, like it was weighed down by all the pain I had been carrying for so long. But I couldn't stay in bed. My mother was still in the hospital, and despite the overwhelming exhaustion, I knew I had to go to her. She was the only reason I had any strength left. Yet, every visit became harder, watching her slip further away, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. It felt like I was losing everything. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The streets were the same, the familiar coffee shop on the corner, the same traffic jams, the same faces in the crowd. But I was different. It was as though the world had color and sound, and I was moving through it in black and white, muted, numb. I would look at people smiling on the sidewalk, walking their dogs, or sipping coffee, and wonder how they could go on with their lives when mine was falling apart. How could they smile when every breath I took felt like it was filled with sorrow? When I walked into my mother's hospital room, I could tell right away that something had changed. She looked weaker, more fragile than she had the day before. Her eyes, once so full of life, were dull, and her skin had taken on an ashen hue. I sat beside her, taking her cold hand in mine, trying to hold back the tears that always seemed to linger just beneath the surface. She gave me a faint smile, but it was laced with pain. She didn't have to say it. I could see it in her face, in the way her breaths came shallow and slow. She was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do. "I'm so tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart clenched at the sound of it. She had always been the strongest person I knew, and hearing her like this made it feel like the world was collapsing around me. "I know, Mom," I replied softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I'm here. I'm right here." But my words felt empty, like I was lying to both of us. I wasn't here, not really. I was trapped in my own pain, drowning in it. As the day went on, I sat in that room, the steady beep of the machines and the low hum of hospital sounds filling the silence between us. I couldn't bring myself to pray. I had stopped asking for miracles, stopped believing that anything good could come from this. All the inspiration I used to draw from my faith had dried up, leaving me hollow. Then, as the sun began to set outside the window, something unexpected happened. My mother, who had been silent for most of the day, turned her head slightly towards me and whispered, "I see him." My heart skipped a beat. "See who?" I asked, leaning closer, thinking maybe she was confused, or the medication was making her hallucinate. "Jesus," she said, her voice soft but sure. "He's here, Jill. He's been with me all along." I stared at her, my mind racing, not sure what to make of her words. But there was something in her eyes, a peace I hadn't seen in weeks, maybe even months. She wasn't afraid anymore. It was as if the weight of her illness, the suffering she had endured, had been lifted, and she was no longer fighting. She was letting go. For a moment, I felt angry. Angry that she could find peace in the face of death while I was left with nothing but pain and emptiness. How could she feel joy when I was losing her? How could she talk about seeing Jesus when I hadn't felt his presence in so long? But then, just as quickly, the anger faded, replaced by something else. Something like hope, though I barely recognized it. As night fell, I left the hospital and drove home in silence. The weight on my chest hadn't lifted, but something had shifted. My mother's words echoed in my mind, "He's been with me all along." Was it possible? Could it be that God hadn't abandoned me after all? But before I could answer that question, life threw me another blow. The next morning, I got a call from the hospital. My mother had taken a turn for the worse. They told me I should come quickly, that it might be her last day. I dropped the phone and felt the world spin around me. How much more could I take? How could I find strength to face this final goodbye when I felt like I was barely holding on? I sat on the floor, overwhelmed, trying to breathe through the suffocating grief that was threatening to drown me. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment that would change everything. This was the storm before the breakthrough. As I rushed back to the hospital, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Tears blurred my vision, and my mind raced with all the things I should have said to my mother, all the prayers I should have whispered when I still had the chance. I hadn't been ready to let her go, and now it felt like time was slipping away faster than I could hold on to. When I reached the hospital, I was trembling. I hurried through the sterile hallways, the fluorescent lights above me buzzing faintly as I moved toward her room. My heart pounded, a heavy drumbeat of fear and despair. I was terrified of what I would find when I opened that door. But when I stepped inside, I froze. There was my mother, lying in her bed, pale and weak, but not alone. The room felt different, like the air itself was softer, lighter. She had her eyes closed, breathing shallowly, and beside her, a nurse was gently holding her hand. My mother's face was calm, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. The nurse looked up at me with a gentle smile. "She's been resting," she said softly. "But she's at peace. You can talk to her." I swallowed hard and moved to sit beside my mother, holding her frail hand in mine. Her skin was cool to the touch, but there was a strange warmth between us, something I couldn't explain. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of all my regrets pressing down on me, but something else lingered in the room, serenity. And then, she opened her eyes. They were weak, but there was a clarity in them that startled me. She smiled, not the tired smile of someone close to death, but one filled with something else, gratitude. "I told you he was here," she whispered. "I've seen him, Jill. He's with us." Her voice was stronger than it had been the day before, filled with conviction. It wasn't the empty words of someone delirious from illness. It was truth. Tears filled my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, the anger and pain that had been crushing me for so long began to fade, replaced by something lighter. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I hadn't been abandoned after all. Maybe my mother wasn't the only one finding peace in this storm. Suddenly, she squeezed my hand, her grip firmer than I expected. "You've been so strong, Jill," she said, her voice still soft but filled with love. "You've carried so much. But it's time to let it go. God is with you, just like He's been with me. You're not alone." And in that moment, I broke. The dam I had built around my heart, the walls I had raised to keep the hurt out, came crashing down. I cried, harder than I ever had, but it wasn't the same desperate grief that had haunted me for so long. It was a release, a surrender. For the first time, I felt peace. I felt His presence. It was as if God had been waiting, all this time, for me to just let go and trust Him. Over the next few days, my mother's health improved in ways no one could explain. The doctors were baffled. They had expected her to deteriorate, to fade quietly into the night, but instead, she grew stronger. Little by little, her color returned, her breathing deepened, and soon, she was sitting up in bed, laughing softly with me like she used to. It wasn't a miracle in the way you'd expect. My mother wasn't completely healed. She was still sick, still fragile. But she had found joy again, and so had I. We talked for hours about life, about forgiveness, about daily blessings and the things we took for granted before. Our bond grew stronger, deepened by the spiritual growth we both experienced. And it wasn't just my mother who changed. I did, too. I found myself talking to God again, not in desperation, but with a positive mindset, thanking Him for each day, for each moment of peace and serenity. I began to see the world differently, not as a place filled with pain, but as one filled with opportunities for hope and gratitude. My prayers were no longer filled with fear, but with a sense of purpose and calm. The weeks passed, and though my mother's health remained fragile, she never lost the peace she had found in those dark days. And neither did I. We both knew her time was limited, but we didn't fear it anymore. Instead, we embraced every moment we had together, filled our days with laughter, inspiration, and faith. One evening, As we sat by the window watching the sun set over the horizon, she turned to me with a smile that I'll never forget. "Jill," she said softly, "I'm ready now. I'm ready whenever he calls." I looked at her, my heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I know, Mom," I whispered, squeezing her hand. "I know." In the end, my mother found her peace with God, and I found mine, too. Life didn't turn out the way I had planned, but in those quiet, still moments, I realized something important. Through all the pain, all the suffering, God had been with us. He had been guiding us, offering divine guidance, even when I couldn't see it. And in the end, that's what mattered most, living a life that pleases God, filled with faith, hope, and love. As the final light of day faded, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for what I had lost, but for what I had found, a connection with God that would carry me through every storm.
Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Shrine of Lightness, and turn on notifications to keep receiving inspiring stories of faith. Together, let's open our hearts to the divine and witness the restoration comes from trusting in God.